Okay, guys, we are going to be looking at part two of Night, at least part two that you will be covering with me. That's going to include parts of both chapters three and four. If you note, we did skip over chapter two. Chapter two would be the shortest of the chapters in Night. It covers just the time that he would have been on a train between his hometown of Saget, Hungary, and the actual camp of Auschwitz. And I would like to show you now where exactly he was traveling. This is Hungary. You can see right here, down here. Germany is up top. Poland was very large, but all of this was occupied territory at the time. So he traveled between Hungary. See, there's the capital city of Budapest. And they would have traveled by train from Hungary through Czechoslovakia into Auschwitz, which is in Poland. If you do notice, all of these little dots represent camps. Some of them are concentration camps, and those would be the ones that are the black squares, and then others are death camps. Please know that all of the death camps, which were designed for that very purpose, are all located in Poland. They are not located in Germany. As far as your author's journey, Elie Wiesel will travel from Hungary to Auschwitz. He will mention to you Gross-Rosen, and then he is going to also mention Buchenwald camp, which is where he is finally liberated from. And liberated means freed. So this is the end of the novel. This is the beginning of the novel. And right here, he just arrived in Auschwitz. This is going to be where we pick up in chapter three. So the beloved objects that we had carried with us from place to place were now left behind in the wagon, and with them, finally, our illusions. Every few yards there stood an SS man, his machine gun trained on us. Hand in hand we followed the throng. An SS came toward us wielding a club. He commanded, "Men to the left, women to the right." 8 words spoken quietly, indifferently, without emotion. 8 simple, short words. Yet that was the moment when I left my mother. There was no time to think, and I already felt my father's hand press against mine. We were alone. In a fraction of a second, I could see my mother, my sisters move to the right. Zipporah, who is Ellie's youngest sister, was holding mother's hand. I saw them walking farther and farther away. Mother was stroking my sister's blonde hair as if to protect her, and I walked on with my father with the men. I didn't know that this was the moment in time and the place where I was leaving my mother and Zipporah forever. I kept walking, my father holding my hand. If you are completing your father-son relationship chart, you would notice that right here, father and son now have a very strong emotional bond. His father was making sure that he was keeping hold of his child, and the child was relying on father for strength, for guidance, for security, for all of the things. He was not going to let him go. Yes, his both his mother and Zipporah did die in this first part of the camp of Auschwitz in Birkenau. His older sisters survived because they were able to prove that they could work. This camp that we just arrived to had 3 different parts. It is massive. It's one of the largest camps, and it was probably one of the most infamous because over 1 million people died in just this one camp. There are 3 parts. The first part is Birkenau. This is the point of arrival. This is the location of the crematorium and the gas chamber combinations. His mother and Zipporah would have been chosen for the gas chamber because Zipporah was only 7 years old at the time, and there's no way that she could have proven that she was capable of working. So there's no chance that mother would have let her 7-year-old daughter go anywhere without her. And that's why the mother would have been killed as well. The older sisters could have been capable of work, which is why they were selected to live. If they make it past Birkenau, where these gas chamber crematories are located, they go into Auschwitz I, which is more the place where horrible experiments occurred. It's also the torture center. It's a place where political prisoners were taken and tortured for information. If they could make it past there, then they would go to part of the camp called Buna, which was a working camp. Those are the 3 parts of Auschwitz, and the entire complex is about half the size of Manhattan. No, I'm not kidding. Behind me, an old man fell to the ground. Nearby, an SS man replaced his revolver in its holster. My hand tightened its grip on my father. All I could think of was not to lose him, not to remain alone. The SS officers gave the order. Form ranks of fives. There was a tumult. It was imperative to stay together. Hey, kid, how old are you? The man interrogating me was an inmate, not a guard. I could not see his face, but his voice was weary and warm. 15? No, you're 18. But I'm not. I said, I'm 15. Fool! Listen to what I say. Then he asked my father, who answered, I'm 50. No, the man now sounded angry. Not 50. You're 40. Do you hear? 18 and 40. He disappeared into the darkness. Another inmate appeared, unleashing a stream of invectives. Sons of bitches, why have you come here? Tell me why. Someone dared to reply, what do you think? That we came here of our own free will? That we asked to come here? The other seemed ready to kill him. Shut up, you moron, or I'll tear you to pieces. You should have hanged yourselves rather than come here. Didn't you know what was in store for you here in Auschwitz? You didn't know? In 1944? True, we didn't know. Nobody had told us. He couldn't believe his ears. His tone became even harsher. Over there. Do you see that chimney over there? Do you see it? And the flames, do you see them? Yes, we saw the flames. Over there, that's where they'll take you. Over there will be your grave. You still don't understand, you sons of bitches. Don't you understand anything? You'll be burned to a cinder, turned into ashes. His anger changed into fury. We stood stunned, petrified. Could this just be a nightmare, an unimaginable nightmare? I heard whispers around me. We must do something. We can't let them kill us like that, like cattle in the slaughterhouse. We must revolt. There were among us a few tough young men. They actually had knives and were urging us to attack the armed guards. One of them was muttering, let the world learn about the existence of Auschwitz. Let everybody find out while they still have a chance to escape. But the older men begged their sons not to be foolish. We mustn't give up hope, even now as a sword hangs over our heads. So taught our sages. The wind of revolt died down. We continued to walk until we came to a crossroads. Standing in the middle of it was, though I didn't know it then, Dr. Mingala, the notorious Dr. Mingala. He looked like the typical SS officer, a cruel though not unintelligent face, complete with monocle. He was holding a conductor's baton and was surrounded by officers. The baton was moving constantly, sometimes to the right, sometimes to the left. In no time I stood before him. Your age? He asked, perhaps trying to sound paternal. I'm 18. My voice was trembling. In good health? Yes. Your profession? Tell him I was a student? Farmer, I heard myself saying. This conversation lasted no more than a few seconds. It seemed like an eternity. The baton moved to the left. I took half a step forward. I first wanted to see where they would send my father. Were he to have gone to the right, I would have run after him. The baton, once more, moved to the left. A weight lifted from my heart. We did not know as yet which was the better side, right or left, which road led to prison and which to the crematoria. Still, I was happy. I was near my father. Our procession continued slowly to move forward. I'm going to press pause here. What he just experienced was something called a selection. This happened at the very beginning of the time that you were in the camps, and it happened periodically throughout. You will see another selection happen both in chapters 5 and 7. And you have this doctor standing there, and the doctor holds a baton, and with one flick of his wrist, he gets to determine whether this person that he looks at is capable of working and thus deserving of life because he has that control of life and death in his hand. If you will notice, he was given guidance by an inmate who got very, very angry with him. One inmate who was saying, you need to say that you are 18 and you need to say that you are 40. And yes, that's a lie. But I guess the thought process is if you're 18, you are stronger than a 15-year-old. And if you are 40, you are stronger than a 50-year-old. So you need to lie about your age in order to pass the selection and stay alive. So this inmate, who may have been a little angry at the time, was still trying to save their lives. The next guy was screaming at him, and he was very frustrated that they had never heard of Auschwitz before. And it took me a while of reading this to go, okay, why would this guy have been so angry that he didn't know about the camp? Well, If these prisoners didn't know the camp existed, that means that nobody else knows the camp existed. And if nobody else knows that the camp exists, then nobody's coming to save them. I would be pretty dang angry too. He gets in front of Dr. Mengele. If you would like to do research on Dr. Joseph Mengele, yeah, he has a lot of he has his place in infamy. Not like fame. Fame is positive, in infamy. So he's very famous, but for very negative reasons. You could look him up. The fact that your author got to meet him and survive it speaks volumes. All right. Another inmate came over to us. Satisfied? Yes, someone answered. Poor devils, you're heading for the crematorium. He seemed to be telling the truth. Not far from us, flames, huge flames, were rising from a ditch. Something was being burned there. A truck drew close and unloaded its hold. Small children, babies. Yes, I did see this with my own eyes, children thrown into the flames. Is it any wonder that ever since then sleep tends to elude me? Because this is written 10 years after he saw this. So that was where we were going. A little farther on, there was another larger pit for adults. I pinched myself. Was I still alive? Was I awake? How was it possible that men, women, and children were being burned and that the world kept silent? No, all this could not be real. A nightmare, perhaps. Soon I would wake up with a start, my heart pounding, and find that I was back in the room of my childhood with my books. My father's voice tore me from my daydreams. What a shame. A shame that you did not go with your mother. I saw many children your age go with their mothers. And he's about 15 right now. His voice was terribly sad. I understood that he did not wish to see what they would do to me. He did not wish to see his only son go up in flames. My forehead was covered with sweat. Still, I told him that I could not believe that human beings were being burned in our times. The world would never tolerate such crimes. The world? The world is not interested in us. Today everything is possible, even the crematoria. His voice broke. Father, I said, if that is true, then I don't want to wait. I'll run into the electrified barbed wire. That would be easier than a slow death in the flames. He didn't answer. He was weeping. His body was shaking. Everybody around us was weeping. Someone began to recite Kaddish, the prayer for the dead. I don't know whether during the history of the Jewish people men have ever before recited Kaddish for themselves. And this Hebrew means, may his name be celebrated and sanctified, whispered my father. For the first time, I felt anger rising within me. Why should I sanctify his name? The Almighty, the eternal and terrible Master of the universe, chose to be silent. What was there to thank him for? And this is in stark contrast with the very beginning of the novel when he talks about how devoutly faithful he was to his faith. We continued our march. We were coming closer and closer to the pit from which an infernal heat was rising. 20 more steps. If I was going to kill myself, this was the time. Our column had only some 15 steps to go. I bit my lips so that my father would not hear my teeth chattering. 10 more steps. 8. 7. We were walking slowly, as one follows a hearse, our own funeral procession. Only 4 more steps. 3. There it was now, very close to us, the pit and its flames. I gathered all that remained of my strength in order to break rank and throw myself onto the barbed wire. Deep down, I was saying goodbye to my father, to the whole universe, and against my will, I found myself whispering the words, may his name be exalted and sanctified. My heart was about to burst. There, I was face to face with the angel of death. No. 2 steps from the pit, we were ordered to turn left and herded into barracks. I squeezed my father's hand. He said, do you remember Mrs. Schachter in the train? A poor lady who screamed about seeing a fire in front of her. Now let's talk about crowd control, shall we? This is the first moments of him being inside of the camp, and it was right after the selection when he was chosen to live. When they could have gone in a straight line from point A to point B, from the selection into a room where they were going to receive clothes, where they were going to have their heads shaved, where they were giving commands and instructions about how to live and how to survive. Guys, they did not have a huge number of guards inside of this camp, which means they had to control their huge workforce of prisoners. They had to control them not only physically, but psychologically. So instead of taking them point A to point B into the place where they were going to receive their stripes, their prisoners' clothing, their uniforms, they took them first right up to the pit from which they saw people being burned. They took them to this place as a lesson. Because after the moment where these people see those other victims burning, at no point does the guard ever have to say to them, if you mess up, this is what will happen. They never have to say it because they have already shown them. This is part of the psychological warfare committed against the victims of these camps. They don't have to say, we're in charge. They just showed them they were. And after that pivotal moment of seeing those children being burned, those adults being burned, what's happening inside of this camp in their first night there, this is what Ellie thinks. He says, never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, that turned my life into one long night 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the small faces of the children whose bodies I saw transformed into smoke under a silent sky. Never shall I forget those flames that consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget the nocturnal silence that deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments that murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to ashes. Never shall I forget those things, even were I condemned to live as long as God Himself. Never. These words, that pivotal moment of that first night that he spent in camp, live in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. I highly recommend, if you are ever in Washington, D.C., to go to the Holocaust Memorial Museum. There is a room in which you walk across a bridge, and underneath the bridge, you see a number of shoes that were taken from various camps in Europe. And all of these shoes represent the victims, the people who no longer get to wear them. And up on the wall, in this room with a super high ceiling, you see the entirety of Never Shall I Forget. I do want to go ahead and share with you that it seems that he has completely given up on God in this moment. I would say, after reading a number of different interviews with this man, that this moment murders his childlike faith. So the person that he was prior to this moment disappeared that night, and he became somebody new. And his faith was transformed from the childlike faith to later in his life, way more of an adult conversation with God. After this moment, when he had his first night there, he and his father stayed together. He and his father experienced a number of different horrific points of dehumanization where they went from being treated like people, like men, to being treated like animals. They were given a uniform. They lost all of the hair on their heads and the rest of their bodies. They were yelled at. They were hit. They were put through all types of psychological damage. And Ellie did receive his tattoo number, so he even lost his name. He became A7713. This shows up later. He receives a tattoo will have for the rest of his life. They stay in Birkenau for only a little bit. They stay in Auschwitz I, which was, I told you, the torture center. That's where he received his tattoo. They stayed there for only a couple of weeks until they were finally transferred to the camp of Buna, the work camp. In Buna, he and his father still stayed together. That relationship is very tight. Ellie would do anything for his dad. His father would do anything for his son. Um, Ellie ended up having his gold tooth taken out of his mouth. The the dentist, the first dentist, was actually collecting teeth for his own profit. He was giving some to Germany and he was keeping some for himself because having a hold of gold he could exchange for a number of things, even staying alive. That dentist got busted, but Ellie ended up having to give his gold crown to a man called a capo, which would still be a Jewish prisoner, but it was one who was put in charge of his fellow man and fellow Jews to stay alive a little bit longer. Most of the people who were in this camp of Auschwitz were never punished for their crimes, many of which because the crimes were committed by other Jewish people who were in charge and put in charge of crowd control. He stayed in Buna, which is the work camp, for a very long time. He stayed in Buna from pretty much June through January of 1945, keeping in mind that the war ends in April of 1945. I am skipping right now to the point where an air raid has just happened. And this air raid, even though the Allies bombed parts of Buna that were responsible for creating um, all kinds of things for the German war effort. They were actually happy about the Allies bombing them because at least it showed that the Allies knew they were there and they were excited. They were ecstatic. Um, and this excited mood caused the Nazis to have to create ways to keep their population, to keep their workforce in check. And this is one way they tried to keep them in check. So the end of chapter 4 has two different hanging scenes, and those hanging scenes are juxtaposed, which means that they are put side by side for the purpose of comparison because they're going to look very, very different. Now, the easiest way to kill somebody in this camp would likely be to shoot him quick, fast, in a hurry. What you're going to see with these hangings is that, yes, the end result is that the prisoner was killed, but this hanging scene is way more about the effect of, um, sorry, I am at school and the bells still happen. Um, the hanging scene is way more to keep the population, their workforce, in control. And so I'll start here. 1 week later, this is after the bombing scene. As we return from work, there in the middle of the camp, in the apple plots, like their center, their gathering area, was a black gallows. We learned that soup would be distributed only after roll call, which lasted longer than usual. The orders were given more harshly than on other days, and there were strange vibrations in the air. Caps off! The loggerel test suddenly shouted. 10,000 caps came off at once. Cover your heads! 10,000 caps were back on our heads at lightning speed. The camp gate opened. An SS unit appeared and encircled us, one SS every 3 paces. The machine guns on the watchtowers were pointed toward the apple plots. They're expecting trouble, whispered Juliet. This is a friend of Ely's. Two SS were back toward the solitary confinement cell. They came back, the condemned man between them. He was a young boy from Warsaw, an inmate with 3 years in concentration camps behind him. He was tall and strong, a giant compared to me. If this guy has survived for 3 years inside the camps, that's a pretty big deal, considering the fact that the life expectancy of a prisoner inside of one of these camps was only 4 months. His back was to the gallows, his face turned toward the judge, the head of the camp. He was pale, but seemed more solemn than frightened. His manacled hands did not tremble. His eyes were coolly assessing the hundreds of SS guards, the thousands of prisoners surrounding him. The Lagertest began to read the verdict, emphasizing every word. In the name of Reichsfuhrer Himmler, prisoner number stole during the air raid. According to the law, prisoner number is condemned to death. Let this be a warning and an example to all prisoners. Nobody moved. I heard the pounding of my heart. The thousands of people who died daily in Auschwitz and Birkenau and the crematorium no longer troubled me, but this boy leaning against his gallows upset me deeply. This ceremony, will it be over soon? I'm hungry, whispered Juliet. At a sign of the Lager test, the Lager capo stepped up to the condemned youth. He was assisted by two prisoners in exchange for 2 bowls of soup. The capo wanted to blindfold the youth, but he refused. After what seemed like a long moment, the hangman put the rope around his neck. He was about to signal his aides to pull the chair from under the young man's feet when the latter shouted in a strong and calm voice, "Long live liberty! My curse on Germany! My curse! My—" The executioner had completed his work. Like a sword, the order cut through the air. "Caps off!" 10,000 prisoners paid their respects. "Cover your heads!" Then the entire camp, block after block, filed past the hanged boy and stared at his extinguished eyes, the tongue hanging from his gaping mouth. The capos forced everyone to look him squarely in the face. Afterward, we were given permission to go back to our block and have our meal. I remember that on that evening, the soup tasted better than ever. Probably because they had just suffered through the bombing, knowing finally that the Allies know where they are. And then you see this boy who is strong. And yes, the boy was going to die. But for the first time in public, in front of everybody, he got to say exactly what he was thinking to the Nazis. He got to say, "I curse you." And everybody there, after knowing the Allies were there and seeing this boy be strong and courageous and brave, they're feeling the same way. Which is why this next scene has such a powerful effect on them. This final scene of chapter 4 is incredibly powerful for many, many reasons. One, he and his dad have been through a lot to this point. It is now summer, late summer. They have been there for a few months. They have seen horrible atrocities. They have been through horrible atrocities. But witnessing this final moment was hard. I watched other hangings. I never saw a single victim weep. These withered bodies had long forgotten the bitter taste of tears, except once. The Oberkapos. This is going to be one of the most important Jewish guards of this 52nd Cable Commando was a Dutchman, a giant of a man, well over 6 feet. He had some 700 prisoners under his command, and they all loved him like a brother. Nobody had ever endured a blow or even an insult from him, and this would have been against the norm. In his service was a young boy, a pipel as they were called. This one had a delicate and beautiful face, an incredible sight in this camp. In Buna, the Pipel were hated. They often displayed greater cruelty than their elders. I once saw one of them, a boy of 13, beat his father for not making his bed properly. As the old man quietly wept, the boy was yelling, "If you don't stop crying instantly, I will no longer bring you bread. Understood?" But the Dutchman's little servant was beloved by all. His was the face of an angel in distress. One day, the power failed at the central electric plant in Buna. The Gestapo, summoned to inspect the damage, concluded that it was sabotage. They found a trail. It led to the block of the Dutch Oberkapo. And after a search, they found a significant quantity of weapons because it's obvious that the Oberkapo was planning to overthrow his guards there in Buna. The Oberkapo was arrested on the spot. He was tortured for weeks on end, in vain. He gave no names. He was transferred to Auschwitz and never heard from again. But his young Pipel remained behind in solitary confinement. This is kind of like a capo in training. He too was tortured, but he too remained silent. The SS then condemned him to death, him and two other inmates who had been found to possess arms. This child is absolutely no older than 12. Youngest would be 8, but no older than 12. One day, as we returned from work, we saw the 3 gallows, 3 black ravens erected on the Appelplatz. Roll call. The SS surrounding us, machine guns aimed at us, the usual ritual. 3 prisoners in chains, and among them the little Pipel, the sad-eyed angel. The SS seemed more preoccupied, more worried than usual. To hang a child in front of thousands of onlookers was not a small matter. The head of the camp read the verdict. All eyes were on the child. He was pale, almost calm, but he was biting his lips as he stood in the shadow of the gallows. This time, the logger Capo refused to act as executioner. Three SS took his place. The three condemned prisoners together stepped onto the chairs. In unison, the nooses were placed around their necks. "Long live liberty!" shouted the two men. But the boy was silent. "Where is merciful God? Where is he?" Someone behind me was asking. At the signal, the three chairs were tipped over. Total silence in the camp. On the horizon, the sun was setting. "Caps off!" screamed the logger'l test. His voice quivered. As for the rest of us, we were weeping. "Cover your heads!" Then came the march past the victims. The two men were no longer alive. Their tongues were hanging out, swollen and bluish. But the third rope was still moving. The child, too light, was still breathing. And so he remained, for more than half an hour, lingering between life and death, writhing before our eyes, and we were forced to look at him at close range. He was still alive when I passed him. His tongue was still red, his eyes not yet extinguished. Behind me, I heard the same man asking, "For God's sake, where is God?" And from within me, I heard a voice answer, "Where he is, this is where, hanging here from this gallows." That night, the soup tasted of corpses. Again, incredibly powerful. The previous scene, when they hung the strong prisoner who had survived for 3 years, who was accused of stealing, when they watched him be strong and brave and courageous, they felt strong and brave and courageous. Watching this child die in front of them had the opposite effect. It's more of a complete challenge to their faith, and it causes many of them to lose hope after having been in surrounded by such evil for such a long time. It hurts them. It hurts Ellie. It hurts Ellie's dad to have to witness something like this. It's a pivotal moment, and this is the center of the novel.